Hunger was not the heaviest burden he carried. It was invisibility. For years he walked among shadows until the night a pair of amber eyes locked on his and refused to look away. That silent moment of recognition became the thread that stitched together two broken lives into one extraordinary bond. Stay with this story, subscribe, and like to keep it alive, and tell me in the comments what part moved you and where you are watching from. Elijah Monroe had grown used to nights where the city felt like it was breathing against him, with sharp, icy teeth, the wind rushing through Denver's alleys like it wanted to scrape the skin off his bones. He carried no home, no safety, no warmth except a fraying blanket and a piece of bread he had saved like a miser hoarding gold. He knew it wouldn't last, but he had learned to stretch scraps the way other men stretched hope. That night, however, something broke the monotony of hunger and cold. Out of the dark alley, he heard a sound, claws skittering against pavement, hesitant but strong, followed by a shadow moving with strange discipline. The figure that emerged wasn't another human seeking shelter, but a German shepherd, ribs showing like the bars of a cage, its fur matted from neglect, its eyes glowing amber under the dim streetlight. Elijah stiffened, ready for the animal to bare its teeth and fight for the food in his lap. But instead, he saw something that arrested him. The shepherd didn't attack. A cluster of smaller strays nosed around the dumpster, scavenging noisily. The shepherd, though clearly the strongest, stepped aside, yielding scraps to the weaker dogs. That act of quiet restraint struck Elijah in a way nothing else had for months. He knew what it meant to be hungry, to want more, yet to let it pass for reasons beyond survival. It mirrored his own life, how he had walked away from fights he could not win, how he had chosen dignity in the face of scorn. For a long moment, man and dog watched one another, bound by the unspoken language of hardship. Elijah's stomach twisted with hunger as he stared at the bread in his hand, his last certainty for the night. His fingers trembled not just from the cold, but from the weight of his decision. Giving this away might mean waking in the morning with nothing. Yet as he looked at the shepherd's steady eyes, he realized the crueler act would be to keep it. Slowly, he tore the bread in half and extended one piece toward the animal. The shepherd's reaction stunned him. Instead of lunging forward like a thief, the dog sat. It lowered itself to the ground, tail wrapped neatly against its body, gaze never leaving Elijah's face. It was as though the shepherd was asking permission, waiting for acknowledgement, that it was allowed to share what so clearly was not enough. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat and whispered hoarsely, "Go on, take it." The words felt strange after so many weeks of silence, but the dog seemed to understand. Only then did it move, walking with deliberate patience, lowering its head and gently closing its jaws around the bread. Not a tooth brushed Elijah's fingers. The shepherd chewed slowly, reverently, as though aware that each bite was a gift too precious to squander. Elijah exhaled shakily, the cold momentarily forgotten. The act was so unlike the harshness of the streets that it cracked something inside him. He blinked against the sting in his eyes, unsure if it was wind or tears. For years he had been invisible to the world, just another shadow under bridges and alleys. Yet here, in the smallest of exchanges, he felt seen by a creature that owed him nothing, that chose to wait instead of take. As the night stretched on, Elijah expected the shepherd to eat and leave like everyone else who passed through his life. But when he shifted to lean back against the brick wall, the dog circled once and lay a few feet away, curling into itself, but keeping its eyes open, its gaze never straying from him. It was not the gaze of a beggar waiting for more food, but of a sentinel, quiet, steady, declaring in its own way, "I will stay here tonight." Elijah couldn't help the small laugh that bubbled from his throat, dry and cracked from disuse. "Guess it's just you and me," he murmured into the dark. For the first time in longer than he could recall, he didn't feel entirely abandoned. The city still loomed cold and merciless, but something had changed. He had given away half his bread, yet somehow he felt richer. The shepherd had taken more than food. It had taken the role of companion, of guardian, of proof that even on a street that chewed men up and spat them out, there was still room for gentleness. As the headlights of distant cars flickered across wet pavement, Elijah pulled his blanket tighter and closed his eyes, aware of the steady breathing nearby, the sound of life shared. Sleep came easier than usual, not because the cold had lessened, but because the silence was no longer empty. That night marked the first stitch in a bond neither of them could foresee, a bond born not of comfort or plenty, but of sacrifice and mutual recognition. Elijah awoke to the gray light of morning, his body aching from the hardness of the pavement, but for the first time in months, he felt the warmth of something beside him that was not just the ragged blanket covering his shoulders. The shepherd had not vanished into the night as he had expected. Instead, it had curled beside him, its body heat seeping into his bones through his thin jacket, and the faint sound of its breathing had lulled him into the kind of sleep he hadn't dared hope for in years. He opened his eyes slowly, half afraid the dog would be gone, and was startled to find it sitting upright a few feet away, ears pricked, watching him as though it had been standing guard all night. The memory of offering his bread came rushing back, and his throat tightened at the thought that such a small gesture had tethered this animal to him, at least for now. He shifted his weight and pushed himself upright, every muscle stiff from cold. The shepherd cocked its head, a low whine, escaping as though worried about his slowness. Elijah stretched his hand out cautiously, unsure if the moment of gentleness from last night had been a fluke. To his surprise, the shepherd moved forward with deliberate steps and pressed its head against his palm, the coarse fur rough against his skin, but the warmth beneath undeniable. It was a sign of fragile trust, and Elijah felt his chest tighten with something he had not allowed himself to feel in years belonging. The streets had taught him to expect betrayal at every corner, yet this creature without words had given him the smallest seed of faith. They spent the day wandering side streets, Elijah pushing his squeaky-wheeled shopping cart with its meager contents, the shepherd trailing a step behind, never straying far. People stared at the odd pair, some with pity, some with disdain, others with curiosity. Elijah ignored them as he always had, but now he felt less like a ghost drifting through the city. Each time the shepherd's paws clicked against the pavement behind him, it reminded him he was not utterly invisible. When evening fell again and Elijah settled into his usual corner near the shuttered hardware store, the shepherd lay down against him without hesitation, pressing close, its weight grounding him. As the night deepened, so did their unspoken pact. He would share what little food he found, and the dog would share its presence, its warmth, and its watchfulness. He could feel its body pressed against his, as though it were saying, "I am here, and I am not leaving." That night, when Elijah drifted in and out of shallow sleep, his peace was tested. A drunk stumbled down the street, muttering curses at nothing, his unsteady feet dragging across the cracked sidewalk. When he caught sight of Elijah's cart filled with cans and scraps of clothing, his face twisted with cruel amusement. With a mocking laugh, he swung his boot at the cart, sending a clang of metal ringing through the alley. Elijah flinched, bracing for the loss of the only possessions he had left. But before the blow could land again, the shepherd surged forward. Its growl tore through the silence like thunder, deep, resonant, dangerous. The drunk froze his eyes wide as the German shepherd planted himself firmly between Elijah and the cart, body rigid, teeth flashing white in the dim light. The man staggered back, raising his hands defensively, and with a frightened curse, he stumbled off into the night. Elijah sat stunned, heart pounding, the reality settling in. This animal had chosen to protect him, not out of duty, not out of training, but out of something else, something deeper. As the dog returned to his side, lying down calmly as though nothing had happened, Elijah placed his hand on its head, fingers trembling with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. The shepherd blinked, then pressed its head more firmly into Elijah's palm, as though dismissing the idea that there had ever been a choice. That night, Elijah lay awake longer than usual, staring up at the flickering streetlight overhead. He thought about the years he had spent invisible, his life reduced to a collection of discarded things, his body reduced to endurance. But now beside him was a creature that had recognized him, guarded him, shared the freezing cold with him. The bond was still fragile, like a glass thread that could snap with a single misstep. But it was real. Elijah woke to the thin light of dawn creeping across the alley, his joints aching as though every stone beneath him had pressed into bone. The first thought that came to him was of food. He reached into the pocket where he had hidden the last piece of bread from the night before, but his fingers met only emptiness. A wave of despair struck him hard, the familiar kind that often followed when survival betrayed him. His eyes darted to the German shepherd curled near his feet. For a moment, suspicion darkened his mind. Had the dog eaten what was left? But before the bitterness could take root, he noticed something strange. Lying near his blanket was an apple, bruised but whole beads of dew glistening on its skin, as though it had just been pulled from some yard or a tree. Elijah picked it up slowly, staring at it in disbelief, then looked back at the shepherd. The dog wagged its tail once almost tentatively, as if awaiting judgment. Elijah's lips trembled into the faintest of smiles. "You brought me this," he asked, softly, voice hoarse with both wonder and hunger. The shepherd didn't answer with words, but its eyes gleamed, and the simple offering spoke louder than anything Elijah had known in years. The dog had given back what it had taken, had shared in return. Elijah bit into the apple, the taste sharp and sweet on his dry tongue, and his eyes blurred with tears. It had been so long since anyone had given him something without demand, without contempt. Here was an animal starved, as he was yet still unwilling to leave him with nothing. The act tore through Elijah's cynicism like light breaking into a shuttered room. He reached out a trembling hand, his breath catching as he touched the dog's chest, fingers sinking into its fur. Beneath the roughness, he felt warmth, a pulse steady and strong, thumping against his palm. For years, Elijah had forgotten the comfort of connection, the reassurance of knowing another heart beat beside his own. That rhythm steadied him, whispered that he wasn't entirely forsaken. He pressed his forehead against the shepherd's neck and allowed himself the vulnerability of closeness. The dog stayed perfectly still, as though understanding the weight of the moment. Throughout the day, they walked together. Elijah shuffled down streets with his cart rattling behind him, the shepherd pacing loyally at his side, head high as if guarding a king instead of a penniless drifter. People noticed them more now. Some scowled, some muttered about danger, but others softened their eyes, drawn to the strange companionship. A shopkeeper left half a sandwich on the curb near them, pretending not to notice when Elijah picked it up. For once, Elijah didn't feel humiliated accepting scraps, because this time he divided it in two, giving half to the shepherd, who ate with patience, chewing as if aware of the sacredness of sharing. As night fell again, Elijah found himself searching for words he hadn't spoken in years. He whispered to the shepherd about the years before the streets, about the construction job he lost, about his family he hadn't seen in a decade. He confessed things he had kept buried, and the shepherd listened in silence, the kind of silence that didn't judge or turn away. When Elijah's voice cracked and his chest heaved with the weight of old grief, the dog moved closer, pressing its body against him, offering not answers, but presence. That night, as Elijah lay beneath the broken streetlight with his ragged blanket wrapped around both of them, he realized he was no longer measuring survival only in crusts of bread or coins in his pocket. He was measuring it in the way this dog looked at him, trusted him, and gave back when it could have taken everything. Survival was no longer a solitary weight crushing him down. It was something carried between two beings, balanced by loyalty and kindness. He fell asleep with his hand still resting on the shepherd's chest, the heartbeat steady beneath his palm. The bond between Elijah and the shepherd had grown stronger each day, stitched together by hunger shared and warmth exchanged. But the streets of Denver had a way of testing anything fragile. As night crept in, the alleyways filled with shadows, not just from the dim street lamps, but from people who found amusement in cruelty. Elijah had learned long ago to keep his head low, to absorb the blows of insults and pretend they did not pierce. But this night, as he settled in near the corner of an abandoned laundromat, with the shepherd curled at his side, voices rose in the distance, mocking and loud. A group of teenagers, restless and reckless, wandered into the street, with cans of cheap beer clutched in their hands. Their laughter was jagged, the kind that carried malice under its edges. They noticed Elijah almost immediately, their attention snagging on the sight of a ragged man and his dog huddled in the shadows. One of them sneered and muttered something Elijah couldn't quite catch, but the intent was clear when the first can came skidding across the pavement, hitting his shopping cart with a hollow clang. Elijah stiffened, bracing for what he had endured too many times before. More cans flew, one bouncing near his head, followed by taunts about bums and strays that sliced sharper than the cold. Elijah raised his arm to shield his face, instinctively curling inward. But before the blows could land harder, the shepherd surged forward. The sound of its growl ripped through the alley, deep and primal, echoing off the walls like thunder. Teeth gleamed white under the flickering light as the shepherd planted itself squarely in front of Elijah. Hackles raised every line of its body, radiating power. The teenagers faltered their laughter, cutting off mid-breath. For all their bravado, none dared step closer to the animal that stood tall, daring them to try. One cursed under his breath, another muttered about finding easier fun, and within moments, the group retreated, their footsteps fading into the night. Silence settled again, broken only by Elijah's uneven breathing. He stared at the shepherd heart hammering, not from fear, but from awe. He had expected abandonment, as he always had. But what he saw instead was loyalty, standing on 4 legs, teeth bared, not for food, but for him. His throat tightened. "You protected me," he whispered, voice shaking. The shepherd turned its eyes, softening tail, giving a single wag, as though brushing aside the idea of choice. It returned to his side, nudging his knee gently, as if to reassure him. Elijah reached out with trembling fingers, stroking the rough fur, feeling the strength beneath. For the first time in so long, he didn't feel like prey to the world's cruelty. He felt guarded, seen, valued in a way that cut deeper than any insult hurled his way. But the night wasn't finished testing them. Hours later, as the city quieted into its uneasy rhythm, Elijah's body betrayed him. A cough tore through his chest, ragged and relentless, each spasm shaking his thin frame. He clutched at his ribs, doubling over as the coughs deepened until his vision blurred. The cold gnawed at him, seeping into his lungs, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath that would not steady. Panic clawed at him, the old fear of dying alone in some forgotten corner of the city pressing down. Yet again, the shepherd refused to abandon him. With surprising force, the dog gripped Elijah's sleeve with its teeth and tugged. Elijah tried to resist, too weak to stand, but the dog pulled again, muscles straining, determined. Step by dragging step, it urged him away from the open sidewalk, away from the cold rain beginning to pelt down from the dark clouds overhead. Elijah could barely comprehend what was happening as he felt his body moved under the awning of a closed grocery store. The rain hammered down cold sheets, bouncing off the pavement just feet away, but he was out of its reach because of the dog's stubborn will. The shepherd released his sleeve and nudged his shoulder, whining softly, its amber eyes filled with something Elijah could only call concern. He collapsed against the wall, clutching his chest, every cough leaving him weaker, but gratitude burned through the weakness. He whispered through ragged breaths, "You saved me again." The shepherd lay down beside him, pressing its warm body against his shivering form, anchoring him to life. Hours passed like that, the rain pounding outside their small shelter, Elijah drifting in and out of painful sleep, but never alone, never abandoned. By the time dawn broke and the storm lifted, Elijah realized the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. This animal was no stray, not anymore. It had chosen him. defended him, carried him when he could not carry himself. The storm had passed, but Elijah's body was still weak, his chest raw from the night before, and yet when the morning sun broke through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the damp pavement, he felt something inside him shift. He sat against the wall of the grocery store. Valor curled tight against his side, the heat of the shepherd's body warming him more than the patchy sunlight. Elijah had begun to think of the dog with that name in his head, even before it left his lips, because after the night of growls that scattered bullies and the pool that saved him from drowning in rain and weakness, the name Valor felt inevitable. Still, he had not spoken it aloud yet, holding it inside like a secret vow he wasn't ready to break. They spent the morning wandering near the marketplace. Elijah's cart squeaking and rattling over the cracks in the sidewalk, Valor pacing at his side with his ears pricked his head high, every inch of his posture proclaiming possession and pride. People noticed them differently now. Mothers nudged their children to the far side of the sidewalk, fearful of the German shepherd's size, but others slowed their pace, eyes softening at the sight of a dog so clearly bonded with a man society had cast aside. Elijah ignored the stares as he always had, but he felt something new behind his ribs, something he hadn't let himself feel in years' worth. He mattered to Valor, and that mattered enough to carry him forward. By midday, his hunger gnawed at him again. He had found a piece of bread crust left discarded on a bench and split it cleanly in two, giving half to Valor as they settled under the awning of a closed newsstand. The shepherd chewed slowly, as though savoring not just the food, but the act of sharing, and Elijah chewed alongside him, both of them, bent over meager scraps that felt like a feast because it was theirs together. A voice broke into his focus, soft but firm, the kind of voice rarely directed at him anymore. "Mister, he's a good dog." Elijah looked up and saw a girl no older than 10 standing before him with a small bundle of wildflowers tied together with string. Her coat was thin, her shoes worn, and the basket at her side was filled with unsold flowers that had begun to wilt at the edges. Elijah nodded uncertainly, unsure if she was mocking or sincere. But the way her wide eyes studied Valor suggested she meant every word. He cleared his throat, ready to mumble something polite when she dug into her basket and produced a crumpled paper bag. She pressed it into his hand before he could protest. "For him," she said simply, and then smiled before hurrying off into the crowd with her basket bouncing at her side. Elijah looked inside and found small treats, the kind sold for pets, slightly stale but perfectly edible. His throat tightened, tears threatening to burn their way free. He hadn't been given anything freely in years, not like this, not without pity staining the gesture. He glanced at Valor, who wagged his tail once, as if understanding the gift had been meant for him. Elijah placed a treat in the dog's mouth and whispered, "See, even angels wear worn-out shoes." The shepherd chewed obediently, his amber eyes glinting in the light, and Elijah knew he could no longer leave the name unspoken. He reached forward, running his hand down the length of the shepherd's back, feeling the strength under the coarse fur, and whispered hoarsely, "From now on, you're Valor, because you guard the only dignity I have left." The word carried weight as it left his lips, more than just a label, more than a name. It was a vow, a promise etched into the cold air. Valor lifted his head, eyes locked on Elijah's face, then barked once, sharp, clear, echoing down the narrow street, as though confirming the bond had been sealed. Elijah laughed softly, a sound rusty from disuse, but genuine. His chest hurt from the coughing. His stomach still groaned with hunger, but in that moment, sitting on the edge of society with nothing but a shepherd at his side, he felt stronger than he had in years. They moved through the day with new rhythm. Elijah addressed him by name, now calling softly, "Valor," whenever the dog strayed too far, and each time the shepherd trotted back, ears perked, eyes shining with obedience and loyalty. The name gave Elijah a sense of control in a life that had been stripped bare of it. He no longer felt like a man drifting aimlessly through alleys. He felt like someone entrusted with responsibility. As evening fell, Elijah settled into his usual corner near the laundromat. His cart pressed close, Valor stretched out beside him. He reached into the paper bag, pulling out another treat, breaking it in two so that they both had something to chew. "We'll keep each other alive," Elijah whispered, voice cracking, but steady in its resolve. "You and me, Valor. That's the promise." The days that followed the naming were both harsher and lighter for Elijah Monroe. Winter's chill sank deeper into the bones of the city, gnawing at the edges of every street, and yet Elijah felt a strange fire in his chest that pushed him forward. Valor had become more than company. He was purpose, a tether, binding Elijah to the present and urging him not to surrender to despair. Each morning they walked together in slow rhythm, Elijah pushing his squeaky cart, and Valor pacing with alert steps, his body taut, and watchful ears flicking at every sound, as if he were patrolling rather than merely following. The city was still unforgiving, meals scarce, coins fewer, but Elijah had begun to talk to Valor like an old friend, sharing thoughts he had buried for years. He whispered about mistakes and regrets, about family faces blurred by time, about the shame that had clung to him as stubbornly as the cold. And Valor listened, amber eyes soft his silence, more healing than any words Elijah could have imagined. But fate as always seemed intent on testing bonds forged in struggle. On one brittle evening, Elijah's exhaustion overcame him. He had spent the day scavenging his lungs, still raw from his lingering cough, his body heavy from hunger. He found himself near the curb of a narrow side street, the light of a single broken lamp casting dull shadows across the wet pavement. He sat down back against the cart, and despite Valor's watchful pacing, Elijah's eyes grew heavy. He drifted towards sleep, the kind of half-rest that left him vulnerable. In that fragile moment, danger struck. A delivery truck, its headlights dimmed from foggy glass, barreled down the narrow street far too close to the curb. Elijah's body slumped into the path without awareness. But Valor saw. The shepherd lunged forward with a strength born not from instinct alone, but from unbreakable loyalty. His teeth clamped down on Elijah's ragged coat, tugging with desperate force. Elijah stirred just in time to feel his body jerk violently backward, his head scraping against the pavement as the truck roared past with a deafening blast of air, its tires missing him by mere inches. The driver hit the brakes, tires screeching, the truck skidding to a stop a dozen yards ahead. Elijah gasped, trembling, staring wide-eyed at Valor, who still had his coat in his teeth, refusing to release until the danger was gone. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might tear through his chest. He realized in that moment that he was still alive, not by chance, but because of the dog beside him. The driver stumbled out of the truck, pale and shaken, muttering curses of shock. He wore a rumpled jacket, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion from long hours. "Are you crazy? You almost got yourself killed," he barked, but then his gaze shifted. His eyes caught on Valor, and his tone broke his voice, faltering. He froze in place as though struck by recognition. Elijah, still catching his breath, followed the man's stare. What he croaked, his voice thin. The man stepped closer, crouching down with the careful movements of someone who knew how to approach animals. His eyes locked on a scar that stretched across Valor's neck, a pale mark nearly hidden beneath the coarse fur. His hand trembled as he pointed. "That scar," he whispered, disbelief heavy in his tone. Elijah blinked, confused, instinctively wrapping his arm around Valor's shoulders, as if to shield him from this stranger. "You know him?" he asked, wary. The man straightened, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket. "I think I do," he said quietly. "I'm Dr. Nathaniel Carter. I work at the veterinary hospital a few blocks away. And if I'm not mistaken, this dog isn't just any stray." Elijah's mind swirled, his heart still pounding from the near accident, trying to understand what was unfolding. Dr. Carter's eyes, however, were fixed solely on Valor, filled with a mixture of shock, recognition, and something almost like relief. Elijah stroked Valor's back, murmuring softly, to calm him, though the dog remained steady tail low, but not fearful amber eyes, watching the veterinarian with quiet intensity. Dr. Carter crouched again, speaking not to Elijah, but to Valor, his voice soft, now almost reverent. "You've been gone a long time, haven't you, boy?" The weight of those words pressed into Elijah like a tide rising too fast. He had nearly died, saved only by the shepherd, who had already proven his loyalty in countless ways. And now a stranger was telling him that Valor had a story, a past larger than either of them had known. The scar on the shepherd's neck, long dismissed by Elijah as the mark of some cruel encounter on the streets, suddenly took on new meaning under Dr. Carter's gaze. The night's chill deepened, and Elijah felt the fragile line of his life tugged towards something greater, something hidden just beyond his grasp. Valor pressed closer against him, as though to remind him of the truth, no matter what stories the scar revealed, no matter what past surfaced. Now the shepherd had chosen him. And that choice had saved his life yet again, seconds before fate might have ended it forever. Summary. In Stage 6, Elijah nearly lost his life when he dozed off by a curb and a truck barreled past, but Valor lunged forward and pulled him to safety. The street was still slick with rainwater puddles glinting in the weak light of the street lamps, and Elijah's chest still heaved from the terror of nearly being crushed under the truck's wheels. But now his fear was replaced by something stranger: confusion. Dr. Nathaniel Carter, the veterinarian who had stumbled into this moment by accident, stood frozen with his eyes locked on Valor, as if he were staring at a ghost. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his bag and pulled out a small scanner, the kind Elijah had seen once at a shelter when dogs were checked for ownership. He hesitated, looking at Elijah with an expression that carried both urgency and respect. "Please," he said quietly. "Let me try. Just let me check him. I think I know this dog." Elijah stiffened his arm, tightening protectively around Valor's shoulders. Every part of him screamed against letting anyone separate them. Yet Valor himself stood calmly, ears flicking, once eyes steady, as though granting permission. Slowly, Elijah released his grip and nodded warily. Dr. Carter crouched low, holding the scanner near the scar on Valor's neck, and the soft beep that followed cut through the night like a bell. The screen lit up with numbers, and Carter exhaled, his voice breaking as he whispered, "It can't be. You're supposed to be gone." Elijah leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean, who is he?" Carter turned the scanner for Elijah to see, though the numbers meant little to him. This is Valor, or at least that was his unit's name for him. He was a police, K9, one of the best. He disappeared nearly a year ago in a warehouse explosion during a drug raid. They all thought he was dead. The words seemed to suspend in the air, heavy and unreal. Elijah blinked, his heart pounding in disbelief. The shepherd pressed closer against his leg, as though sensing his unease. "A police dog," Elijah murmured. "You're telling me this dog belonged to them?" Carter nodded, his voice still carrying the awe of discovery. "Not just belonged. According to records, he saved 3 officers that night, dragging one out of the flames before the building collapsed. They never found him afterward. They presumed he died, but here he is alive, with you." Elijah's throat worked as he tried to swallow the weight of it. He stared down at Valor, who looked back at him with steady amber eyes that betrayed no fear, no regret, only loyalty. The thought that this dog, this creature who had chosen to sit with him in the cold, who had pulled him from the path of death twice now, had once been a trained hero, was overwhelming. He whispered softly, "You were always more than I knew." Carter's gaze softened, though urgency still flickered in his expression. "The department will want to know. Dogs like this, they're heroes. They're celebrated. If they learn he survived," Elijah cut him off, his voice raw but firm. "No, he's with me. He chose me." Carter studied him for a long moment, his eyes reflecting both understanding and conflict. "I can see that," he admitted, "but you must understand what this means. This dog isn't just a stray. He has a history, a legacy, and yet he stayed with you instead of finding his way back to them. That says something powerful. Valor leaned into Elijah's side, his body language calm and certain, as though confirming the truth of Carter's words. Elijah laid a hand on the shepherd's neck, his fingers brushing the scar that now told a story far deeper than he had ever imagined. He thought of the way Valor had sat patiently before taking the bread, the way he had brought back an apple as repayment, the way he had faced down bullies, dragged him to shelter, and saved him from death in the street. All of those moments had felt like miracles in themselves, but now he knew they had been backed by training courage and a past filled with acts of loyalty that had already changed lives. And still, despite everything, Valor had not returned to uniforms and sirens. He had returned to Elijah, a man with nothing, a man who had believed himself invisible. "Maybe they think you're dead," Elijah whispered, "but you're alive here with me, and I'm not letting go." Carter's face softened, further recognition and dawning that this bond was not one to be broken by protocols or paperwork. He nodded slowly. "I won't report it yet, not until you're ready. But Elijah, you need to understand you're holding the loyalty of a hero in your hands. Don't take that lightly." Elijah nodded, tears burning behind his eyes. "I don't. I never will." Valor rested his head on Elijah's knee, a quiet gesture of solidarity that erased the uncertainty pressing in from every side. The secret was out now, at least between the three of them. Valor was not simply a stray saved by kindness. He was a hero reborn from fire and loss, carrying scars that proved his survival. The night that Dr. Carter revealed Valor's secret past weighed heavily on Elijah's mind, and even as he pulled his coat tighter against the bitter cold, he could not shake the knowledge that the dog he had fed with scraps of bread was more than just a stray. He had been a hero, a savior of lives, a dog whose name had once been spoken with reverence by officers in uniform. Elijah kept replaying Carter's words, imagining the scene of flames engulfing a warehouse, the chaos of shouts and gunfire, the moment when Valor had pulled men from the jaws of death. That such a creature had chosen to stay with him to guard him when no one else did was almost too much to accept. Carter had lingered with them longer that night, kneeling to stroke Valor's fur, murmuring that he should be returned, that the department would want to know their hero still lived. Elijah's heart clenched at the suggestion, panic rising in his chest like the onset of another coughing fit. The thought of Valor being taken away from him, celebrated by strangers, paraded as a symbol of courage, while Elijah himself was left behind in the shadows, was unbearable. He had nothing else, and the very idea of losing the only being who saw him as worth protecting made his ribs ache, as though they were already empty. Carter seemed to sense the desperation in his voice when Elijah whispered hoarsely, "He's not going anywhere. He's with me now. He chose me." Carter said nothing in that moment, but his eyes were thoughtful, calculating, filled with compassion, yet edged with duty. The following day, when Elijah and Valor huddled outside the marketplace, Carter returned. This time, he was not alone. 2 shelter workers walked with him, their uniforms neat, their faces kind but businesslike. They spoke in low voices about bringing the dog to warmth, to care about how he needed treatment, about how Elijah could not possibly provide what was necessary. Elijah's chest tightened as he realized their intentions. They were not just here to offer help. They were here to take Valor. He pulled the shepherd close, his fingers sinking into the rough fur, holding on with a grip that trembled but did not loosen. "No," he rasped, "you can't have him." One of the workers tried to soothe him, speaking gently, as though to a frightened child. "Sir, this dog is special. He belongs where he can be cared for properly." Elijah shook his head violently, his eyes blazing for the first time in years. "He belongs here, with me." At that moment, Valor seemed to understand. As one of the workers reached with a leash, the German shepherd jerked back with sudden force, letting out a howl so piercing it rattled windows and sent birds scattering from the rooftops. The sound was not mere noise, it was anguish and defiance wrapped in one. Valor wrenched free of the worker's hands, darting to Elijah's side, pressing his body against the man's thin frame, head buried against his chest as though to declare in the clearest way possible where he belonged. Elijah's arms wrapped around him instinctively, his tears soaking into Valor's fur. The shelter workers froze their expressions, shifting from procedure to awe. Even Carter stood speechless, his mouth slightly open as he watched the animal he thought he knew reveal loyalty deeper than any training could instill. Slowly, Carter raised his hand to stop the workers. "Leave him," he said softly. "He's already chosen." The tension ebbed, replaced by silence, broken only by Elijah's sobs and Valor's steady breathing. Carter crouched beside them, his voice gentle now stripped of duty. "I was wrong to think he should be taken away. He's made his decision, and maybe you both need each other more than anyone else realizes." Elijah lifted his head, eyes bloodshot but fierce, whispering, "He's all I've got." Carter nodded, his expression one of deep respect. "Then he stays. But you both need help. You can't survive this winter out here, not in your condition, not with his either. Let me offer you something. Come with me to my rescue shelter. You'll have a bed, warmth, food, and Valor will be safe with you. I won't separate you, I promise." Elijah hesitated, suspicion warring with desperation, but when he looked down at Valor, who wagged his tail slowly, trustingly, he realized there was no betrayal in accepting. For the first time, someone was offering help without conditions that tore him apart. He nodded slowly, whispering, "All right, but only if he stays with me." Carter smiled faintly. "He will." That night, Elijah and Valor followed Carter to the rescue shelter. The building was small but warm, filled with the faint smells of straw, antiseptic, and food. Elijah had not felt indoor warmth in years, and the strangeness of it nearly broke him. A cot was set up in a corner for him, blankets clean, pillow soft. Valor lay at his side, refusing to leave, even when staff offered a separate bed just for him. When Elijah drifted into sleep, Valor's body pressed tightly against him, Carter observed quietly from the doorway. Life inside Dr. Carter's shelter was a different world, one Elijah Monroe had not believed he would ever see again. The cot was small, the food plain, but to a man who had spent years curling against cold brick walls with his stomach gnawing at itself, it was paradise. Valor stayed close every moment, his amber eyes never straying far, his body curled protectively against Elijah's side at night, and his steps steady alongside him during the day. For weeks they lived quietly, helping with chores in exchange for warmth and safety. Elijah found himself carrying buckets, sweeping floors, and learning the rhythms of feeding the rescue animals. It was work, yes, but it was work that felt human, and that in itself was a gift. Still, the weight of the outside world pressed close. Dr. Carter had promised not to report Valor. Yet Elijah knew secrets like theirs were fragile things, easily shattered if the wrong eyes saw. He kept his head down, focusing on the daily tasks content with the routine of survival that now felt steadier. But fate has a way of pulling stories into the light. One crisp afternoon, Elijah and Valor were in the yard cleaning up after the dogs when a young woman approached the fence. She carried a notebook and a camera, her curious gaze flicking between man and dog. She had been speaking with Carter earlier about the shelter, writing notes, asking questions, and now her attention fixed squarely on them. "That your dog?" she asked through the chain-link voice laced with intrigue. Elijah stiffened his instincts, screaming to turn away. But before he could answer, Valor trotted up and pressed his head against Elijah's hip, his loyalty painting a picture stronger than any words. The woman's face softened, then sharpened with recognition of a story waiting to be told. "I'm Rachel Ford," she introduced herself, pulling out a press badge. "Freelancer. I write human interest pieces. And I think you two are the story." Elijah shook his head, mumbling, "We're not a story, just trying to live." But Rachel was persistent, asking gently, asking respectfully, coaxing pieces of his tale. Dr. Carter, standing nearby, added enough for her to stitch together a narrative without revealing Valor's hidden past: the homeless man who had shared his bread, the dog who had stayed protected and saved him. Reluctantly, Elijah agreed to one photograph, just one of him sitting on the shelter steps with Valor's head resting on his lap. He thought it would vanish into the endless noise of the world. Instead, it exploded. The article titled "Homeless Man and His Guardian Dog" appeared online 2 days later. The photograph captured something raw: Elijah's gaunt face, worn by hardship, and Valor's steady, noble gaze. The story struck chords across the country, a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the power of companionship in the harshest conditions. Within hours, it spread shared across news sites, social media feeds, and television broadcasts. People who had never known Elijah's name spoke it now, their voices filled with admiration. At first, Elijah wanted to crawl back into the shadows. Attention felt dangerous, exposing, threatening to unravel the fragile peace he had built. But Valor always steady pressed against him, as if to remind him that hiding had never saved him before. Slowly, Elijah began to see the good in what had happened. Letters arrived at the shelter, donations poured in, and visitors came not just to gawk, but to offer help. One day, a representative from a nonprofit organization arrived. She introduced herself as Linda Harris from a charity dedicated to homeless outreach and animal welfare. She carried a folder of papers and spoke with a kindness Elijah hadn't heard directed at him in years. "We read your story," she said softly, "and we think you'd be perfect for a position at our new project. We need someone to care for abandoned dogs, someone with patience, someone with experience in surviving hardship and still offering love." Who better than you? And Valor. Elijah's heart pounded as her words sank in. Work. A job. The one thing he had stopped dreaming of, the thing he had thought forever denied to someone like him. His mouth went dry, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You'd trust me with that," Linda smiled. "We trust both of you." The offer was not charity, but opportunity, a doorway back into dignity. Elijah looked at Valor, whose ears perked at the sound of his name. He thought of all the nights on the street, the half-shared meals, the way the shepherd had pulled him back from the brink of death again and again. He realized they had been preparing for this all along, proving themselves not only to each other, but to the world that had once forgotten them. He accepted, his hand trembling as he signed the papers. The weeks that followed brought change Elijah had never dared to imagine. He wore clean clothes provided by the charity, carried keys to a modest room near the shelter, and spent his days tending to animals who had been cast aside, just as he once had been. Valor became both partner and mentor to the new arrivals, guiding nervous strays with calm authority, showing them through example that trust could be rebuilt. Elijah often caught visitors watching with tears in their eyes, whispering about the miracle of seeing man and dog heal together. For the first time in years, Elijah woke each morning with purpose burning in his chest. He was not just existing, he was building something. The weeks after Elijah began his new work at the shelter flowed with a rhythm he had never known before. Each day he rose with the sunrise, fed the dogs, cleaned their kennels, and walked with them in the yard, his heart filling with purpose in each small act. Valor remained always at his side, both partner and protector, guiding nervous strays with a quiet authority and watching over Elijah with unshakable devotion. The staff marveled at how the shepherd seemed to sense Elijah's thoughts, responding before words were spoken, moving with him like two parts of one soul. For Elijah, the transformation was almost unbearable to process. After years of believing he was invisible, a ghost drifting through alleys and sleeping in shadows, now he was not only seen, but needed. Visitors came daily, drawn by the viral story of the homeless man and his guardian dog. They wanted to shake his hand, thank him, donate to the cause. Elijah accepted awkwardly, his voice rough but sincere, always directing the praise back to Valor. "He's the reason I'm here," he would say. "I only gave him bread. He gave me everything." The story grew so large that one day the local police department reached out. They had seen the article, recognized the scarred shepherd, and realized who he truly was, the K9 thought lost in the warehouse fire. They asked permission to hold a small ceremony to honor Valor publicly for his past service, and to celebrate the bond he now shared with Elijah. At first, Elijah recoiled at the idea, fearing it was a trick to take Valor away. But Carter reassured him, promising no one could force the dog from his side. Eventually, Elijah agreed, believing Valor deserved the recognition even if it frightened him. The day of the ceremony dawned bright and cold, a pale winter sun shining down on the courtyard outside the shelter. A small crowd gathered, officers in uniform, reporters with cameras, families with children clutching programs. Elijah stood at the edge with Valor pressed close, his heart hammering as memories of ridicule and invisibility threatened to overwhelm him. But Valor's steady weight grounded him, reminding him of every night they had survived together, every time they had saved one another. When the ceremony began, an older officer stepped forward. His voice shook as he spoke of the warehouse fire, of the 3 men pulled from the flames of the night when Valor had disappeared and been mourned as a fallen hero. "We thought we lost him forever," the officer said, his voice breaking. "And to see him here alive, it's a miracle." He stepped closer, tears streaming down his lined face, and called out, "Valor, come." The crowd hushed, waiting. Valor lifted his head, ears twitching at the familiar command, the echo of old training pulling at him. For a heartbeat, Elijah's chest tightened with fear that the shepherd would obey, that he would return to the life he once knew and leave Elijah behind. But then Valor did something extraordinary. He turned away from the officer, walked to Elijah, and pressed his head against the man's shoulder, his amber eyes soft but unwavering. The meaning was clear. His family was here, not in the past, not in the uniforms, but with the man who had given him half a loaf of bread in the dark. The crowd erupted in applause, many wiping tears, and the officer covered his face with his hand, weeping openly as he whispered, "He's chosen. He belongs to you now." Elijah could not hold back his own tears. He bent low, wrapping his arms around Valor's neck, his voice raw with gratitude. "You could have had the world," he whispered, "but you chose me. I gave you half my bread and you gave me back my life." Valor wagged his tail, the slow, deliberate rhythm of devotion, his eyes glistening as though he understood every word. Cameras flashed, people clapped, and yet for Elijah, the world had shrunk down to just the 2 of them, bound by a promise no stage or speech could capture. In the days that followed, the ceremony faded into memory, but its message endured. Elijah continued his work at the shelter, his life no longer defined by hunger and shadows, but by the care he gave to animals who had been abandoned like he once was. Valor remained his partner in all things, never straying his presence, a constant reminder that even those left broken by the world could find redemption through love and loyalty. Elijah often sat at night with Valor's head resting on his lap, whispering into the quiet, "We saved each other." And though his words were cracked with age and hardship, they were truer than anything he had ever spoken. The man who had once believed himself invisible now lived a life witnessed by many, but more importantly cherished by one. And in that simple truth lay the lesson of their story, that a single act of kindness, even as small as sharing bread, could ripple outward to change not only one life, but 2, binding them together in a bond stronger than circumstance, stronger than pain, stronger even than the weight of the world. Summary. In Stage 10, Elijah and Valor were invited to a ceremony honoring Valor's past as a police K9. The end. If this story touched you, take a moment to support by liking the video and subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I'd love to hear what part of Elijah and Valor's journey struck you the most and where you're watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.